This Strand Titan build is still god tier. If you loved our Strand builds the past few seasons, well, you're not going to be disappointed because they still wreck. Now when I say they, I mean two different Strand builds. The one with the Final Shapes exotic, Wishful Ignorance, where you gain additional Frenzied Blade charges that you can just launch into the air, which basically causes some stupid damage to enemies, but also Synthoceps. Now for all you new and returning players here, you're going to like this one if you haven't used the build before, or you need a freshly updated version since it's been some time. So with this build, we're going to use Synthoceps to buff our melee's DPS, which again, if you're new around here, this is one of the best go-to builds for the Titan, and actually my main build I use 95% of the time when I play Destiny. It carries you through endgame activities, even whilst massively underpowered. It carries you in day 1 dungeons, and it's literally an ad clearing and mini boss destroying beast. Not only will get our melee abilities back faster to use frequently, which also goes kinda wild if you've got any melee buffing modifiers active, but we'll have a strong super for damage as well, while also benefiting from Banner of War for the healing and damage boost. So if you're someone who needs a build to keep you alive in endgame content or as a solo player, then this build is 100% for you. And also guys, if you still prefer the other build from last season using Wishful Ignorance, I have also updated that build too for this season, and although I won't cover that in today's video, I will have a dim link and Mobalytics written guide for you down below along with this one. But despite all the nerfs to Synthoceps, Banner of War and Strand in general of the past few seasons, this build hasn't aged at all. It's still going strong, and this is your Titan Strand ability DPS build, updated for Destiny 2 episode Revenant. So guys, let's jump straight into it. Roll the intro. Now firstly, before we start, if you guys like this build and you want to see more top builds like this for episode Revenant, then be sure to check out the full playlist down below, or you can find them over on my Mobalytics page. But one thing that makes this build so good compared to a lot of other Titan builds is that we will constantly have that Banner of War active, which continuously pulses us with health so that we just can't die. And in activities like Onslaught, where you have so many enemies running around and so many tough adds and bosses, you'll just be able to run around freely like a god, staying alive, but also melting everything that gets in your way as well. It is one of the strongest Titan builds in the game to date, but just be aware of exploding enemies because you might still tank that damage and stay alive, but explodies are gonna probably insta-kill you because this build is designed in a way where we get health back in pulses, not in a way where you can survive 10 exploding enemies coming at you all at once. So just be careful around those enemies and you should be good. Now there are two things that make this build so powerful the way it is, and technically they are the only two things that you need for this build to work, so everything else just makes the build even stronger. So those are the Synthoceps exotic arms and the Banner of War aspect. These are the core elements of the build that will allow you to tear away at enemies with some serious damage, especially when you have Banner of War at a ×4 stack. But with Synthoceps, this will buff our damage to our melee and also our super at the same time when we are surrounded by enemies. So you want to make sure that you're always surrounded by enemies so that that buff is active, because if it's not, you won't be able to pull off that crazy melee DPS, and if that is the case, you might end up dying if you're not able to kill some of those tougher enemies that are hitting you pretty hard. But with Banner of War, what this does is give you Banner of War that pulses with energy, that heals you, as well as nearby allies, increasing your melee and swords damage. Targets defeated by you and allies nearby charge the banner, increasing the speed of the pulse, stacking up to 4 times. You will need to activate this with a melee attack, a finisher, or a sword to begin that Banner of War, but once it's up, just killing enemies will extend it, and despite all the nerfs to it, it still lasts a really long time, and it's still easy to maintain those higher stacks in harder difficulty content. Now, Banner of War will buff our melee's damage by 40%, and at the same time periodically heal us, whereas Synthoceps will do the same thing, buff our damage, but stacking it up to 165% while surrounded. So as long as you have those adds around, then that buff will be active as well. And you want to combine those two high damaging perks with other things like a GL for weakening a boss from this season's artifact, because if you do that, you'll literally deal some serious damage to melt down champions and bosses quickly this season. The build isn't as good as it once used to be, but it still does pack a punch. Now the way you would use this build in all types of content is you would first start by using your melee ability on an enemy, or get a sword final blow. This will activate Banner of War, granting us health pulses and a stackable damage buff to your melee's damage. From here you just go around killing enemies with final blows to build up the Banner of War stacks. Then when you are ready to cause some serious damage with a ×4 Banner of War stack, be surrounded by enemies and just go in for the melee hits, or use your super. That's basically as simple as it gets. It is a really strong and effective build to use, but also a really simple build to use as well. So it doesn't take degree level education to understand how this build works. Just literally run around with a Banner of War is as simple as it gets. Now getting into the setup of this build, we are a Strand Titan build, so we will have the Bladefury super, But for abilities, we're going to have a Rally Barricade as it has a shorter cooldown to help with our other cooldowns when it does come to using mods, a Frenzied Blade melee which will give us 3 charges, and then a Grapple Grenade because the grapple is just so fun to use, but it also provides us with that grapple melee attack too. For aspects, the first one you want is Into the Fray, so that destroying a tangle or casting a super grants Woven Mail, and while we have Woven Mail, our melee regeneration rate is increased, so that just helps to get our melee back quicker, but also provide us with extra damage resistance. If you were going to use the Wishful Ignorance exotic, then you would replace that aspect with this one here, so that you can launch projectiles from the melee whilst in the air. But for our second aspect, we have the Banner of War, which is no surprise, as it is one of the best aspects in the game still, but this will just give us health and extra melee damage. For the fragments, you want Thread of Generation, so that dealing damage grants grenade energy, Thread of Fury, so that damaging targets with a tangle grants melee energy, Thread of Warding, so that picking up an orb of power grants Woven Mail. This just helps us to easily get Woven Mail through orbs rather than tangles. But lastly, Thread of Transmutation, so that while we have Woven Mail, weapon final blows create a tangle, and that can be achieved with any weapon. So the weapon loadout I'm using with this build is primarily the cool rocket sidearm to help clear tougher enemies, and a sunshot as my main ad clearing weapon. But you would want to change your weapons to suit the activity that you're going into though, so that you can stun any specific champions that you might be going up against. The exotic armor is going to be Synthoceps as I mentioned earlier, as this just helps boost our melee's damage. Your alternative is Wormgod Caress, but from my experience using this, it's harder to maintain and the easiest approach is to just use Synthoceps, but that option is there if you want to give it a go. As for mods, in the helmet you just want a Siphon mod matching your main ad clearing weapon so that you can generate the orbs of power. Then in the arms you want a heavy handed mod and 2 impact inductions for reduced grenade cooldown. For chest you just want your damage resist mods. Legs, a few more cooldown mods mostly for the melee. For the class, again just more cooldown mods. And then for your stats, your main goal is to get resilience, discipline and strength all to 100 as your triple 100 stat build for the Strand subclass. For the artifact here, there isn't really anything massively benefiting us. We do just have our GLs debuffing enemies to give us more damage against some bosses, but since this build doesn't rely heavily on artifact perks this season, it just means you can use this build in any season that you're playing and still benefit from the build exactly the same as you normally would. So any season that does bring new perks benefiting the Strand subclass or abilities, then that will just make this build even more powerful. But if that does happen in a future season, I will be sure to update this build to cover it then. Now this is my main and my best Strand Titan build in the game right now that I use on a regular basis, since it's both fun to use but also a very strong build that keeps you alive while maintaining that high damage output from the melee. So if you're new around here, then definitely give this build a try, because I can promise you this build will not let you down, since it's never let me down. But that is all for this newly updated Titan Strand build in Destiny 2 episode Revenant. Next, you guys should check out the playlist down below for more new, fun and top builds for Destiny 2 season 25, and until that next video, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.